Aloha, everyone, again, and thank you again so much for being here and being so eager to learn more about the artist and to support this incredible exhibition. On behalf of the organizations represented this evening, of course, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, Legion of Honor, and HOMA, we'd like to extend our sincerest gratitude to you for being such an important part of our rich and vibrant arts communities here in Hawaii and beyond. Most of you know me, of course, but in case you don't, my name is Amy Endres, Public Programs Manager here at HOMA. And we've been working very hard to curate an exciting series of programs that allow us to delve into the many facets of Mary Cassatt's work and legacy. In it, we'll consider her artistic practice and her various identities as a female artist, a professional and entrepreneur, an American, an impressionist, an art advisor, a feminist. These in the context of charged intersections of gender, class, and politics in the late 19th and early 20th century. There's a lot to unpack, so shall we dive in? We are honored to have with us the curators of each of the three iterations of Mary Cassatt at work, Jennifer Thompson, Emily Beeny, and Alejandra Rojas Silva, for a candid, behind-the-scenes conversation in which they will share their curatorial visions, the unique choices they made, and special insights into how Cassatt's life and art practice influenced their approach, as it traveled, of course, all the way from Philadelphia to San Francisco and finally here. The exhibition and accompanying catalog were organized by the Philadelphia Museum of Art, as Penny mentioned, and brilliantly co-curated by Jennifer Thompson and Laurel Garber. And while Laurel Garber could not join us this week, we will get to hear more about her curatorial work in the exhibition later in the series. On August 8th, she and the PMA's Conservator of Works on Paper, Christina Taylor, will join us for a conversation about Mary Cassatt's innovative print techniques. They'll talk about the making of their short film on Cassatt's set of 10 prints, followed by a discussion with Alejandra. And it's going to be a fantastic talk. So definitely mark your calendars. You definitely won't want to miss it. And now please allow me to introduce our speakers. These women are three extremely accomplished curators. So for brevity, I'll highlight just some of their credentials, but their full biographies are, of course, on our websites. First, this exhibition is the result of years of research and planning, the brainchild of originating curator Jennifer A. Thompson, the Gloria and Jack Drozdick Curator of European Painting and Sculpture, and curator of the John G. Johnson Collection. Thompson is head of the European Art Department at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and curator of the Rodin Museum. She earned her MA and PhD at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Since joining the museum in 1999, she has published widely and curated many notable exhibitions, including The Impressionist's Eye, Old Masters Now, celebrating the Johnson Collection, Discovering the Impressionists, Paul Durand-Ruel and the New Painting, Van Gogh Up Close, and Late Renoir. Next, we recognize Emily A. Beeny, Chief Curator of the Legion of Honor and the Barbara A. Wolf Curator in charge of European Paintings at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. Beeny, a specialist in French paintings and drawings from the 17th through 19th centuries, received her PhD from Columbia University. She has also held significant curatorial appointments at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena, and has organized notable exhibitions with such figures as Watteau, Poussin, and Manet. Excuse my French, I speak Italian. We look forward to her exhibition exploring the relationship between Edouard Manet and Bertha Morisot opening this fall. And finally, we celebrate Alejandra Rojas Silva, our curator of European and American art here at the Honolulu Museum of Art, who curated HOMA's presentation of the Cassatt exhibition, adding new dimensions to the stories so brilliantly told in the previous iterations. She holds an MST in art history from the University of Oxford and an MA and PhD from Harvard University in Latin American art. Prior to joining HOMA, she was an assistant professor of art history at Ohio Wesleyan University and a lecturer at Ohio State University. She has curated exhibitions in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Colombia, and the United States, ranging from pre-Columbian to contemporary art. And she recently co-curated two beloved exhibitions, Home of the Tigers, McKinley High and Modern Art, and Satoru Abe, Reaching for the Sun, which is still up until July 20th, so please go see it. So without further ado, please join me in giving them all a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you very much for those lovely introductions. And again, thank you both for being here. You have a delightful evening ahead of you listening to these two wonderful women talk to you about their insights into Cassatt. What we're going to do this evening is hopefully Jenny and then Emily and then me are going to give a preview of what each of our iterations was like. And then we will move on, ask each other a few questions, and then hopefully have enough time to let you ask your questions of our speakers. I just want to one more time say that both Jennifer and Laurel are the reason we have this amazing exhibition, even when it changes in our different iterations.
Thank you for the lovely introduction and the warm welcome that I've received the last couple of days. It's really thrilling to see a project that I've worked on for about 5 years travel the country, moving further and further west, and to see it in a new sort of iteration, a new blooming in each of these venues. I'm going to start by maybe sharing with you a little bit of the genesis of the exhibition, because it has been a number of years in the making, and I think it might be names. I'll start with the facade of the Philadelphia Museum of Art as it appeared last summer as we were advertising the exhibition here. Even though Mary Cassatt was born in Pittsburgh and only lived in Philadelphia for about 7 years of her 82-year-long life, Philadelphians think of her as one of their own. And so when you work in Philadelphia or live in Philadelphia, you're very aware, as a curator of European art, of Mary Cassatt's legacy in the city. And you still run into people who knew members of the Cassatt family. Shortly after Cassatt's death in 1926, the museum held a memorial exhibition. And I'm showing you an image of it here with a group of schoolboys who are lined up, I think fairly eagerly looking at the exhibition. I'll just point out that the picture right in the center of this wall is Driving, which is just upstairs, along with a number of other works you might recognize from collections at the Met or San Francisco and elsewhere. So Philadelphia has a kind of a pattern of hosting exhibitions on Mary Cassatt, starting in 1927. It did this again in 1960, most recently in 1985. But it had been quite a long period of time since we had really addressed Cassatt as an artist and as a critical member of the French Impressionists, but also as someone who plays a role within the American art world. And so I've been working on and off on Cassatt for much of my career in Philadelphia. But in 2019, my colleague Laurel Garber joined the museum, and Laurel is a specialist in prints, and everything I know about Cassatt prints I've learned from her. So I strongly encourage all of you to come back on August 8th to hear from Laurel and Christina about Cassatt's printmaking. But shortly after Laurel arrived, we started to sort of dream about doing a Cassatt exhibition. And then not too long after she arrived, there was a pandemic, which sent us all home. I used that as an opportunity to read the 180 letters by Cassatt and her family members that are in the Philadelphia Museum of Art Library and Archives. I had, by some chance, taken a scan of them home with me when I was in lockdown. And one of the things that struck me about the letters is that she was always talking about work. about working 8 to 10 hours a day, about the effort it was to work, saying that many of her sort of family and friends didn't understand that she was a working professional and that she didn't have all day to spend socializing. And that caused both Laurel and I started to think about what work looked like for Cassatt, because there are no images of her studio that survive. She didn't leave diaries or descriptions of her working practice. And so we decided that in order to understand Cassatt's artistic practice, we were going to need to look really intently at what she left us, which is an extraordinary body of paintings, pastels, and prints. And so we spent about 2 years bringing all 84 of the Cassatt works in the Philadelphia Museum of Art collection into our conservation studios. And we would unframe them, we'd put them on easels, we would invite a variety of our colleagues. So in this photo, you're seeing a curator of American art, you're seeing an American painter, Bill Scott, who was very useful at reminding us the sort of practical side of what it means to paint and what you can and can't do with oil. You're seeing Laurel here as well, but we brought in summer interns, students from local universities, with the idea that everyone can look at Cassatt and start asking questions about how she's making these work. Making her works, and it became extraordinary kind of time of exchanging ideas. We of course were also involved in X-raying the paintings and the pastels to try to see what we could find out using imaging techniques about what was below the surface. And what that taught us was that Cassatt was someone who was quite impatient and moved quickly and had a great deal of, she might have worked hard to achieve her images, but she also had a great deal of confidence in what she was doing. So she wasn't afraid of sort of scratching things out or maybe in this case, in this situation of this pastel, of just sort of adding new things on top, covering up a change that she wanted to make. But then when we took that into our special exhibition galleries, we made a couple of decisions about how we would present the show. And we decided not to present it chronologically, not to start with her earliest works and end with her latest works, because that's often what's done with Cassatt. And we felt that we wanted to kind of shake it up a little bit and to look at some of the key themes, ideas and images that she would return to over and over again during the course of her career. So sometimes we would have a gallery of 30 years worth of images of women reading, and it enabled us to kind of dig into what she was trying to achieve and how it evolved over time. Another thing that we did that was actually very nicely carried on by our colleagues at other institutions, which was to mix the media. So we would have paintings next to pastels, next to prints, because we don't know for sure, but I don't think that she would set aside a week or two just to do paintings and then a week or two just to do pastels or prints. I think she was picking these things up maybe even within the course of a day or two. So we wanted some of that sense of experimentation and exchange of ideas across media to come out. I'm going to show you just a few images of the installation in Philadelphia. We chose very strong wall colors because we wanted the works to kind of sort of pop off the wall and to be to sort of to have a great deal of wall power. Every one of us and all curators have to contend with the space, the architectural space that we have for our special exhibitions. In Philadelphia, we have about 12,000 square feet, which is quite a vast space. But the first sort of 2,000 feet or so have a very low ceiling. They have maybe a 10 or 11 foot ceiling because there's a mezzanine. Actually, my offices are directly above these galleries. So you come in through a space that has lower ceilings, and then you enter the body of the bulk of the exhibition, which has very high ceilings. So you always have to plan to have a much more intimate space in the beginning. And we use that space in the beginning to introduce Cassatt, to do sort of abbreviated timeline of her life, to include some of the letters from the Philadelphia Museum of Art collection, and then to introduce each of the media in which Cassatt worked. So we introduced a painting, a pastel, and then prints. And that was sort of a surprise for some of our visitors that Cassatt was so active with pastels and with prints. Our next, this is when we enter what gets called the high space, where we have 20-foot ceilings. We also have a number of columns that support the floor above, so we have to incorporate the columns one way or another into our exhibition space. And we decided here to kind of play up a park-like theme, both with this vibrant green color. But on one side of the gallery, we had a number of images of women out and about in public. So maybe at the opera, driving a carriage, walking through parks in Paris. And on the other side, we wanted to explore Cassatt's turn to women in private and in domestic spaces. And this very large gallery gave us an opportunity to contrast the ways that she tackled both those subjects. And then right on the far wall, it's right in the center here, you have women with hats and veils and gloves, and are they leaving? Are they going? And it was kind of a playful way of joining these two ideas. We did devote one gallery exclusively to prints into the set of 10, because it is a complicated process that Cassatt went through to achieve these color prints. And we did want to make sure we devoted a good amount of real estate to that subject. And that this is where, you're not seeing it in this image, but this is where we also had the video, which explains her printmaking process. We had a gallery devoted to what we called handwork. So it was the subject of women working with their hands, often with needlepoint embroidery, knitting and crocheting, also some banjo playing. This was a way of inviting visitors to look and pay attention to Cassatt's hands, and the fact that she often shows her sitters doing something. These are not sort of idle or passive images of women. Quote we used on the wall is one that Ali has picked out too, which is, "My fingers fairly itch to get to work again." I think equally we played around with the idea of putting on the wall a quote that Cassatt often said, that women should be someone, not something. And I think part of her exploration of these works is to get at women being someone and not just being sort of objects. And that she wants to indicate the sort of seriousness of their activities and occupations. It was a very large gallery. You're only seeing a snippet of it here, devoted to childcare. And this is the subject Cassatt's often known most for, is her women and children combinations. And we really dug in here to explore the ways in which she's very attentive to the work of raising a child. And so moments where you see women with sort of exhausted faces, a sort of sense of tedium or patience coming out. And that Cassatt it's not always sentimental. There are some sentimental scenes, but there's a kind of toughness and a very attentive eye that she has to the reality of what it's like to look after a child day after day. And then our final gallery was a chance to reflect on many of the themes that had come up in the exhibition. It also was a gallery that was largely devoted to portraits of Cassatt's family members. And so it was interesting to kind of reflect in the way that she is interacting as an artist with some of her family members, and to sort of bring things back to sort of some of her key goals, in that she, both in the ways in which she was making her work visible on the surface of the canvas, but also bringing out a particular personal view on the lives of women, and what she felt was very modern and very new, and a way that she could bring the core of her kind of modern technique to what she felt was a very contemporary subject. And on that note, we'll pass it on to Emily for the next venue and iteration of the exhibition.
For the sequel. So, this amazing exhibition next appeared at the Legion of Honor in San Francisco, and I was really thrilled that we were able to bring this extraordinary piece of research and this extraordinary group of objects that Jenny and Laurel had brought together to share with West Coast audiences. I'd been hearing about the project for several years from Jenny and from Laurel, And it was originally meant to appear only in Philadelphia. And so the moment it became possible actually to partner, I went to my director and said, we must take this exhibition. So the Legion of Honor, as many of you know, is the museum of European sculpture, decorative art, painting, as well as graphic art and art of the ancient Mediterranean for San Francisco, set in a lovely park overlooking the Pacific. It's a museum that was founded in 1924, in November of this year. And so we have been celebrating our centennial over the course of the year, from November to November. We're in the midst of the celebration now. And so this exhibition really gave us an extraordinary opportunity to kick off our centennial celebration with an exhibition that explored the work of a groundbreaking woman artist. This felt like a perfect rhyme with the story of the museum's founding by a groundbreaking woman who was a patron of the arts and a sort of visionary of cultural philanthropy in San Francisco, Alma de Bretteville Spreckels, whose name certainly will have resonances with Hawaiian history that many of you will be familiar with. And you can see that the building that Alma dreamed of, that she devised for us, is a sort of 3/4 scale, a miniaturized version of a Parisian hôtel particulier, the Palais de Salm, the last sort of great Parisian private residence constructed before the French Revolution. So this is all just to say that it is a much, much smaller place than the Philadelphia Museum of Art on its majestic sort of Acropolis-like hill overlooking the Schuylkill River. And so we needed to scale down the exhibition considerably in order to fit it into our galleries. I knew that there would be various ways that we needed to adapt the project to suit our audience and to suit our space. And it was so amazing how up for it Jenny and Laurel were to really allow us to make the show suit the conditions we were working under. Among other reasons why this project made so much sense for us in San Francisco is that the Fine Arts Museum's collection contains this extraordinary portrait of Cassatt's mother, who was really the companion of so much of her adult life. And although I think in many ways slightly bewildered by her daughter's life choices, not least the, decision not to get married, not to have children, to pursue an artistic career, as her real calling, was in the end her great supporter as well, and lived with her in Paris for over 20 years. So this is a portrait of her in her 70s, a really amazingly tender and insightful likeness, and a masterpiece of our American paintings collection, though we can talk more about the extent to which Cassatt, as I think we might all agree, is actually a European painter. We also are the fortunate recipients of a recent gift of 2 quite spectacular pastels from the former collection of Anne and Gordon Getty, which was dispersed at auction at Christie's just a few years ago. And these 2 pastels were purchased anonymously by a donor to our museum out of that collection sale to give to us. So you see at left here a pastel called The Long Gloves, which features one of Cassatt's very favorite models. Cassatt was very fond of redheads. And this particular model is somewhat distinctive, recognizable for her slightly crossed eyes. But we see her putting on these beautiful sort of evening gloves. And then at right, A Kiss for Baby Anne, which is, a sort of quintessential mother and child image, at least in terms of how it was marketed. Though we can talk more about the conditions under which it was made, the actual studio conditions under which these images of women and children were produced. So here you see the entrance to the exhibition in San Francisco, in our much sort of smaller and more linear special exhibition space. We began the show with this work from the Flint Institute of Arts, which is really a portrait of Cassatt's sister Lydia, and seemed to pull together many of the threads of the exhibition. The idea of women's work, of handwork, as Jenny just said, her sisters were at work on this tapestry screen, but also the work of making, because it is a picture that calls attention to its own process of making in various ways. We see this pattern of attention beginning to emerge in Cassatt's work of really focused naturalism and precision in the rendering of her sister's face, a face known by heart for sure. And then this much kind of blurrier, more inchoate approach that starts to happen, for example, in her sister's hand. A kind of blur of movement, certainly, but also a blur of brush strokes as we watch Cassatt's brush move across the canvas. And in the first space, we really, as Jenny and Laurel had, wanted to make sure that we combined oil paintings, pastels, and prints, since this is one of the most groundbreaking aspects of the exhibition, is the bringing together of the different media, so we can see how she worked across media and how her work in one medium informed her work in another. And so this really very special pastel that she shows in her first outing with the Impressionist group in 1879 occupied this same first space of the exhibition in San Francisco and gave visitors an occasion to discover some of the technical research that our colleagues in Philadelphia had done into the making of Cassatt's pastels. So here we see a detail that shows where the edge of the fan moved. So there are, oh dear, and I'm going to have to use the pointer. Forgive me if I don't get the, okay, great. So what we see are actually these sort of pentiments here of other placements of the fan, which she progressively seems to have closed to reveal a larger swath of the audience behind her, the sort of balconies behind her. So it's this process of restless revision that we see happening, and confident, perhaps sometimes slightly overconfident working methods. This section also contained a group of prints, many of which are in your superb presentation and Alejandra's lovely hang of the show here, including this print, which belongs to the same group of works focused on female audience members at the opera. It's an etching, an aquatint, and I think really gives us a sense of what drew Cassatt to this printmaking medium in the years immediately following the 1879 exhibition. Her interest in exploring kind of tone and atmosphere and texture, using progressive sort of washes of aquatint to conjure the shadowy interior, the velvety textures of an opera box, of the opera house, the kind of glimmering gaslit faces of the audience opposite. So this is sort of the end of the conclusion of the first exhibition, section of the exhibition in San Francisco. The next section focused on images of children and childcare, picking up more of the kind of thematic approach developed by Jenny and Laurel in Philadelphia. We wanted to gesture to that thematic approach, even though our presentation was a bit more conventional, a bit more chronological in San Francisco, both because of the linear layout of our galleries and because Cassatt is not a native daughter of San Francisco. San Franciscans don't really know the story of her life and the progression of her work in quite the same way. And so kind of telling that story of how her style evolved felt quite important. But in this section on children and childcare, we drew out some of the themes of Jenny and Laurel's research into the relationships between the women and children who appear in her famous mother and child iconography. So Cassatt is very happy to title exhibit, certainly above all sell, her images of women and children as images of mothers and children. But as Jenny and Laurel pointed out, the women in her paintings are seldom the mothers of the children in their arms. These are works of art created in a fully professionalized studio context. And so even when we have an image like this that conjures so vividly the kind of intimacy of the caregiving relationship, it's interesting to consider the somewhat artificial studio context in which they were created. Here, in this magnificent pastel from a private collection, we, I think, have such a vivid sense of what it feels like to have that hot little cheek pressed against your own, which is something that pastel is uniquely well suited to convey, I think, because of its special powdery texture. Of course, the traveling of pastels is ferociously difficult since these are uniquely fragile objects. And so it's really extraordinary and fabulous that you have two pastels by Cassatt in your very own collection, and that they are presented here in Honolulu. Cassatt's experiments with pastel, I think, show even greater daring, perhaps, than her oil paintings at an early stage. Here we see this detail of the wallpaper. We really see how she's several years out ahead of Degas in her experiments with abstraction, this sort of like lightning bolts of color that animate the wallpaper behind this pair. One thing that our display in San Francisco allowed us to do was bring together works that had been distributed into different thematic sections in Philadelphia and sort of group some of them by medium or by moment in her career. And this is an example of that. A group of dry point prints that she undertakes around 1889, 1890, right after she's acquired a printing press that she keeps in her studio. And this set of prints really represents a shift in her printmaking practice away from that sort of tonal, textural approach that we see in the etchings and aquatints early on, and towards something much more sort of rigorously linear, a kind of return to her roots as an academically trained draftswoman. So it's a group of prints that she produces 12 of these prints, and we see two examples here. There's a beautiful array of them in the exhibition, as Alejandra's hung it here, and you have several splendid examples in your permanent collection. I think we get a sense of how she's looking at old master drawings and maybe placing herself alongside some of those figures, particularly from the early Renaissance, metal point draftsmen. The dry points also allowed us to kind of set up the context in which Cassatt created the set of 10, to which Jenny alluded, which I think for many art historians is Cassatt's single most important intervention into the whole history of art. Many of us might think of her as, the painter of mothers and children, but in terms of how she sort of changed the way that future art was made, the set of 10, this group of color, etching, and aquatints that she develops in 1890 after a transformative encounter with Japanese prints, is really kind of the game-changing moment by many measures. So we were pleased to be able to present the full group, which, as you can see, shows scenes from the everyday lives of Parisian women of Cassatt's social class. So scenes of childcare, of sort of the toilette, of dealing with correspondence, of commuting, of shopping. And then to take one of these prints, really the first in the series, and therefore the most experimental, in which she's kind of figuring out this technique, as you'll hear more from Alejandra about, I'm sure, and how she actually did that figuring out. So to be able to present 13 states of this print as she sort of working with a master printer called Modeste Leroy, kind of works out how she's actually going to reverse engineer the effect of a Japanese woodblock print using a copper plate and Western intolerant techniques. I think, the fact that she preserves all of these states is evidence that she's not just interested in the product of her work, not just interested in the destination, but interested in the journey and in sort of sharing, in the end, some of the work that goes into evolving her finished compositions. And so in San Francisco, we created a sort of complementary section to the exhibition that was really about, when is a work finished? The sort of question of finished and unfinished in Cassatt, and the extent to which she reveals the process of making in many finished works, or at least works that she eventually decides are finished and signs her name to. This work from a private collection was a prime example of that. A scene of probably a domestic employee giving a bath to a young child. We have this amazing degree of finish in the head of the baby that, to me, always recalls the head of Holbein's Henry VIII as a child. And then, so here we have this wonderful detail. And then there's a Willem de Kooning in the corner. This amazingly free and gestural area of paint application that I think in the end she comes to understand, perhaps, through the persuasion of the young dealer Ambroise Vollard. She comes to understand this as a potentially finished canvas, even though it is in various respects quite obviously unfinished. This provided, I think, a really helpful context for understanding our pastels, which display really similar patterns of attention, tightly finished faces, and then compositions that dissolve into their kind of constituent marks as you move outward from the center. And also our portrait of Cassatt's mother, which, as you can see at lower left and at upper right, again, there's this sort of dissolution into slashes of paint. The composition becomes sort of borderline illegible. And I think there were questions, since this particular work wasn't signed, as to whether she actually considered it, I wondered anyway, whether she actually considered it finished. Well, one thing that we were able to do in the exhibition is borrow a print she made after this composition from the National Gallery of Art, that she took through multiple different states. And that really, I think it's a recordo of the painting. It's a print that commemorates the painting and kind of ratifies its status as finished. You know, if the painting was finished enough to be recorded in a print, and surely it's finished enough for us. The final section of the exhibition dealt with the sort of mother and child theme, sometimes called the modern Madonna theme, because, of course, Cassatt's return to images of women and children, easily interpreted as images of mothers and children, really plugged her into an old master tradition. You know, we know that she had spent lots of time copying after Correggio. There are certainly traces of Botticelli and Raphael in many of these images. And yet, these pictures that she paints in the final decades of her career have too often been written off by modernist art historians as, you know, kind of kitschy, or tea and nurseries and tea, you know, this sort of stereotype that she's painting for a market and that these are kind of facile. I think the context in which we wanted to encourage visitors to think about these pictures really was the context of series paintings. Because at the moment when Cassatt is painting mothers and children again and again and again and again, this is the same moment when Monet is painting water lilies again and again and again. When Cézanne is painting the Mont Sainte-Victoire again and again and again. When Renoir is painting the nude again and again and again. And while we tend to take seriously the deep formal explorations involved in series paintings for her male colleagues, why do we have a different attitude towards Cassatt's images of this more charged, gendered subject matter? So I think with that, I'll pass it over to Anne. Oops, sorry.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. I want to start by kind of acknowledging how much generosity was given to me by Jennifer and Laurel, not just in our actual collaboration in creating the iteration here, but in the sheer framework of their rethinking about Cassatt. It is serious enough that it really makes us stop and rethink this author, but also flexible enough that both of us were able to really adapt it in a great way to our audience. And both Emily and Jennifer and Laurel gave me access to all of their materials if I needed to use them for any part of our iteration, making my job much easier and our exhibition here much fuller. So in terms of our exhibition, we were bringing a few less items, partly moving things across the Atlantic is Pacific. Thank you. Moving things, I usually work across the Atlantic. Moving things in my scholarship. What? Yes, thank you. So across the Pacific is strenuous. It's difficult to get loans over here. But also, as we're talking about spaces, our temporary space is also going to be much smaller. So what we were also considering is how to bring the themes that Jenny and Laurel kind of brought out into this space, but also make it resonate with our audience. And they were incredibly generous at letting us within conversation, but if I said, can I add this, can I do this, they were like, go with it. So best collaborators. So in a way, I took on that idea of medium, but I've also given each medium kind of its space. I covered some of what or took from what Emily did this section purely for dry points, and I did that also purely for etchings. However, it is clear that the most interesting part of this is to see the relationship between two. So the way it plays in our galleries upstairs is you can rarely look at a painting without seeing a dry point or an etching. If you turn around, you will see that. I'm moving in the wrong direction again. Okay, sorry. So, for example, here, we have tried to give the majority of the paintings that we have their own wall, their own space, give you enough time to really, really look and examine. But if you turn your head, you'll see a dry point that relates to it. Or here, you cannot quite see it. I'm moving around now. But right next to the woman in the lodge, in the end of that wall is the woman at the opera that you were talking about. So every time you look, you'll see something to relate to and something to kind of understand how she's playing with themes. Very bad with this pointer, I apologize. Here too, you can see both the paintings and the pastels at the end. We don't really have time to go into it, but later if you come visit me, I'll give you details on any one of these spots. But here again are like the etchings and aquatints all in a row, and here's some of the dry points. But in the set of 10 part, we have, we didn't get to show the whole set of 10 as they did in Philadelphia and San Francisco, but we were able to get the bookends of this. To your right, you will see the second state of the bath, which in San Francisco was shown every state of that. We have done a tech version of that, which means in a little iPad next to it, you can see how she moves quickly through the states until she gets into that colorful print. But you can see all the experimentation. And then you also have the letter, which is her very last in the set of 10, by which she only needed 3 states to get there. And again, I'm going to let you, because you're going to come back, you're going to want to let Christina really go deep into that explanation. But I'm going to tell you a little bit of what we did, given our strengths. So as a lot of you know, we have one of the best collections of Japanese art outside of Japan, especially of Japanese prints. And Cassatt, as Jennifer and Laurel told us, was mesmerized by the 1890 exhibition of Japanese art. She's talking about it, she's thinking about it, she's writing about it. And we decided to put that print next to some of prints that we have, editions of which Cassatt would have seen. We know she would have seen in Paris. So my wonderful colleague Stephen Salel went through the trouble of doing all this great homework for me and or for us. And so we know of 250 prints that were at that show. He went through all of our prints and realized that we have 69 of those prints. I know. And I want us to also I put them together for 2 reasons. 1, because they're just absolutely amazing to see. 2, because as Emily said, it is one of her most innovative moments in a year. She kind of figures out how we reverse engineer this. And so here you see a woodblock print. They're very different things. You can see here the grain of the woodblock print. What she's producing in copper is something completely different. But you can see the interest she has in the pattern and the flatness. And in the letter, you can see that same kind of patterning in the wallpaper and in her dress, and even kind of the act of closing an envelope is something you can see in some of the prints that she had seen. I'm going to move really quickly because I don't want us to lose the opportunity to talk to our guests. But the other part of the collection that we did, and we did something with, is in the Honolulu Museum of Art, we have 9 different works from Cassatt in oil, 2 pastels, a colored aqua tint, and a series of dry points, and 1 etching. Which is actually extraordinary for a museum our size. And as Penny mentioned, the banjo lesson came into our collection during for our foundational gift. And I just wanted to really quickly say something I started connecting in my head when thinking about Cassatt and when thinking that our founder, Anna Rice Cook, brought this print to our museum when she started it. This is an often remarked upon quote by Anna Rice Cook, that a statement she read at the museum's opening. So many of you will be familiar. I'll go quick. That our children of many nationalities and races, born far from the centers of art, may receive an intimation of their own cultural legacy and wake to the ideals embodied in the arts of their neighbors. That Hawaiians, American, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Filipino, Northern Europeans, Southern Europeans, and all other people living here, contacting through the channel of art those deep intuitions common to all, may perceive a foundation on which a new culture, enriched by all the old strains, may be built in this island. It's a mouthful. But I saw in her, she's not just, I cannot do this well, doing the, she's not just collecting and giving to the museum a Cassatt. At around the same time, she's given the museum many Japanese ukiyo-e prints, which are the things that are making Cassatt revolutionize Western art. I just give you 2. Stephen would be the person to talk to about this with. And I wanted to look at your pastel. Maybe Emily has a minute to tell us something beautiful that she was discussing with us earlier about the pastels, how we have a proof and a counter proof if people have the time. If not, I'll tell you this story some other time. And last, almost last, I also wanted to just let you all know that on the event of this exhibition, we conserved 4 of our Cassatt prints. This is just to give you an example. And finally, I won't have time to talk to you about La Caresse, but we also conserved this one. The one we have up in the gallery right now came from Philadelphia because our version was torn and not looking well, but now, from now on, we'll be able to show it. And finally, the exhibition finished with our very old friend, the Child's Caress. I was hoping that by moving through this new framework that Jenny and Laurel were so nice to give us, by moving you through that, you would eventually come and see this painting that we are all quite familiar with, but see it anew. See it within this new context that they have so generously given us. Okay, thank you. I think, depending on how much time we have, I might just start with 1, maybe 2 questions. I had more, but I want to make sure that you have enough time to ask them what is on your mind. So, maybe, what drew each of you personally to Cassatt? And how has this changed or evolved over the course of this exhibition? You might have already said a little bit of that, but
I think, and I'm still not, I think Cassatt is such an interesting figure, and Emily alluded to this, and that she is American. She's born in Pennsylvania. She maintains an American passport throughout her life, but she spends 56 years of her life living in France. And she is one of the Impressionists. And that's really the framework in which art historians are used to thinking about her. But yet in American museums, she's often classified as American. And I think Emily and I and our colleagues in Washington might be the only 3 curators or 4 curators of
She's
European
an American
art.
in San Francisco.
Oh, she is. Oh, no. Well, we work on that. But it's true that Cassatt has this sort of somewhat ambiguous relationship with, her, whether she's an American or whether she is, she's living in Europe for most of her life. And I think that sort of, she can be slippery in a way in terms of how to categorize her. She doesn't sit comfortably. And I mean, she's a painter, but she's also so active with pastels. She makes more pastels than she does paintings. And then printmaking is this just extraordinary. I mean, it's a much more perhaps concentrated period of her career, about 30 years when she's really digging into printmaking. But it's some of her most exciting and innovative works. So she's difficult to kind of come to terms with. And then you have to grapple with her personal life, and that she was from a very wealthy Philadelphia family. And so she really didn't have to work, but she chose to work. And she chose to work with chemicals and sharp tools and printing presses. And so she had to kind of grapple with what was expected of her socially from her parents or family in Philadelphia, but then the desire to be recognized as a very active and well-respected artist in Paris. And so she's sort of doing a balancing act throughout her life. And then that part of that balancing act means that she can't get married or have a family, because it just wasn't possible to do both at that time. And so I find that fascinating. I thought maybe by working on this, I would come to a greater understanding of how she navigated this. And I can see how she did it, but I don't know that I can fully grapple with really what it meant for her to sort of navigate all of these aspects of her life and her career.
I mean, I agreed. I think, her sort of, she's a paradoxical figure in all sorts of ways. As an American without whom we cannot understand the story of French Impressionism, as the great creator of images of mothers and children who did not have children of her own. I've been thinking about her a lot in relationship to Berthe Morisot, the other sort of quite famous female impressionist, and a founding member of the group from 1874. I'm developing an exhibition, shameless plug, that will present at the Legion of Honor this October through February on Édouard Manet and Berthe Morisot, their friendship and collaboration. And I think it's so interesting and so telling that in the early critical literature, the reviews of the Impressionist exhibitions, Morisot and Cassatt are so often set up as sort of like a rivalry of some sort. I think just because they're the two sort of leading ladies in the group. But of course they were in fact friends and, had a complicated relationship. But I think not at all the sort of rivalry that critics would have liked it to have been. And so I think that has given me an additional way in to thinking about Cassatt.
Wonderful. And then I'll just ask one other, unless you have a question you'd want to ask one another. In front of a lot of people. It's a great opportunity.
Alejandra, I was hoping you would tell us a little bit about the sort of interactive dimension of the exhibition that you've introduced for the Honolulu presentation.
Oh, absolutely. That is most to do with the way we work as a museum and as an institution. So one part of it is something, all of them we developed with our learning and engagement group, but one of them is mostly due to Stephen. After he made this great list for us, we do have a couple of iPads, and you can go through each of them and see all the other colored prints that we have, which is lovely. And then because of Laurel and Jennifer, who asked Christina, Christina developed this video that you'll see upstairs, which kind of explains the process by which Cassatt was able to create, or what she imagines was the process by which she was able to create the letter, that one image set of 10. And when I was asking, I was saying, just printmaking is so hard to understand. It's so hard to explain to audiences. And they suggested, why don't you bring the plates themselves, the copper and the prints, and show them so that there is something kind of more palpable about them. And so we did that as well. But the part that surprisingly has the most excitement is we produced a set of stamps that will then layer color in the way you have to sometimes layer color in woodblock print, or even in copper plates. And so if you press one of them, you will. To be honest, the reason I did this is Stephen got me to go to this fabulous seminar in Tokyo, Japan. And while I was there, I saw an ukiyo stamp print just like that. And I was mesmerized and I did it. And then I just was like, we must do this at some point. And what I can tell you is it is the thing that people most remember. And sadly. No, but I think it just gives you a sense of the difficulty of it and of the process. And when you think about the process, we go back to work and how much work these things involve. Great. Should I open it up to you? Do we have questions that we want to ask? Okay. You ask the question, and I am going to repeat it only so that the recording can hear you. So go ahead. Just stand up and ask. So do you think Cassatt regretted not having children?
So she does write late in life that and I think she's quite lonely at that point, because both of her brothers, with whom she was very close but lived in Philadelphia, had passed away. And so I think, she was mindful that she was living in France and sort of trying to get her nieces and nephews to visit her occasionally. And that's when I think she began to really reflect on, how the labor of her, of her working career, and even, spoke about how much recent photographs of her taken in her late 70s. She said, you can see the impact of the work that I did on my body. But it's true that I think for the most of her life, she was busy. She said, I'm a busy woman. And she was very driven and very ambitious, maybe because her parents sort of pushed her a little bit and said, are you sure you want this career? And so I think she felt she had to prove herself. And I think she enjoyed it. I mean, I do think that she, enjoyed the camaraderie with the other Impressionists. She enjoyed the role that she played. And when Americans would come to Paris, she would take them to the dealers and say, you should buy this or you should buy that. This, buy a Monet now, and it's going to go up in value. And she appreciated being part of this much larger art world. And I think that was for her. It was very, very satisfying. But certainly, there are some very poignant comments late in life that she does regret not having a family around her.
Did Cassatt create other work other than her family members where you could see male faces?
There are she does a handful of portraits. I'm thinking of a friend, Moisey Dreyfus, that she does a pastel portrait of him. But it's right. You're absolutely right to observe that she does very few men in her paintings. Most of them she's related to them, and partly it was access. She had access to her father and to her brothers and her, certainly her nephews. We have a painting in Philadelphia dated 1873, and she writes to a friend, "It's the first time I've included a male face in any of my pictures," and it's a picture in which the male face is in shadow. And I'm actually not entirely sure that it isn't a female model that she kind of made to look a little masculine. And I don't. Obviously, she had more. It was easier to have access to women. There were many more women in her life, and it was was comfortable and acceptable for her to have them posing with her. But I think she truly just found that she was a woman in Paris, and so that much of what she's painting or depicting or episodes and moments that she can really understand as a woman. And so that became her subject, that became her niche, something that she could bring to the new painting, Impressionism.
Did she edition her prints, and was it partly in order to market herself or to sell more?
So I think the kind of salient example for this is the set of 10, is this magnificent set of color prints of scenes from the lives of sort of everyday lives of Parisian women. The pulling of these prints, since each color, of course, lives on a separate plate, as we've heard from Alejandra, was an extremely laborious process. And she brings in a master printer to work with her and create an edition. The idea is an edition of 25 of each of those prints. She doesn't seem to have completed the edition of 25 for each of them, which is a pity for us today because it means they're ferociously difficult to borrow because they're quite rare. And I think that perhaps one of the reasons why the edition never in the end gets finished is that she's intending to show them at an exhibition of a society of painter printmakers that she actually helped to found, the Société des Peintres Graveurs, that in the spring of 1891, when she's going to show the set of prints, they changed their name to the Société des Peintres Graveurs Français. Mm-hmm. And so as the holder of an American passport, she is no longer qualified to participate in this exhibition. And so Durand-Ruel allows her to sort of show the set in an adjacent gallery, but I think she doesn't get the kind of publicity out of that display that she would have gotten if she had really been able to join forces with this group that she had helped to found. And so that's, I think the reason why that edition stays sort of smaller.
Yes. Thank you. As you were talking about her brush strokes, I was wondering kind of your thoughts on this. Was she painting quickly because she was a woman? And just kind of aware of the fact that she was maybe having to outdo the men or work more than the men or, kind of compensate for being one of the only women kind of in that space. That was one thing. The other thing, I've been struck by women in the arts and science. I'm thinking of Hilma af Klint. I'm thinking of Mileva Maric, Einstein's wife, how important their fathers were in their ability to kind of take the path that was not typical for women of their time. And I'm wondering if, given that she came from a very wealthy family, whether her father played a really key role in maybe encouraging her or helping her feel more confident to kind of go down this road that maybe wasn't typical, and kind of whether she had to be quite brave and courageous to do what she did in terms of her choices. Thank you.
Maybe I'll answer a question about her father, and you can talk. Because it's fascinating to think about that in terms of Maurice. I'm just actually starting to think about the impact of Cassatt's parents on her work, and to dive a little bit more deeply into that, she told a biographer in 1913 that when she told her parents she wanted to be an artist, her father said, "I would almost rather see you dead than have you be an artist." But then, when you read the letters that he's writing home to his two sons in Philadelphia, they are always talking about Mary's hard at work in the studio. Mary's having a great success. He is her greatest champion from the 1870s and the 1880s. It's her mother, as Emily says, who's a little bit not sure about the profession that Mary has suggested. And, well, if she's not married, it's good for her to have something to do. It's kind of her mother's attitude. But many of Cassatt's friends would observe that it was her mother's kind of intellectualism and her reading and her sort of real engagement with contemporary events and politics that was so formative for Cassatt. One of the things that that we've made drawn a fair amount of attention to with this exhibition and certainly the catalog is a letter that Cassatt's father writes home to her brother in December of 1878. And he, at that point, says, "I have told Mary that her studio has to pay for itself. So she has to sell works if she's going to pay for her studio rent, if she's going to pay for any of her materials or her models." And he's really, at that point, cutting off the purse strings. And I maybe he thought this will end it, that she's going to have, she has to support her art making hobby. It has the opposite effect. I think it's very closely related to her just extraordinary launch into the Impressionist movement and the Impressionist exhibition that happens the very next year. And then she becomes deeply involved in the art market and thinks about how to promote her work and how to work with Durand-Ruel to make sure that he is giving her as much attention and time in the galleries. But it is said, and I think it's a good point, that a French critic writes of Cassatt in the later 1890s, that she was born of a family of business people, and her brothers are businessmen, but I think she was extraordinarily savvy as well as a businesswoman. All kinds of connections with the family that I think could be.
I think your question about painting quickly is so interesting. Obviously, the sort of valorization of painting quickly is something that happens within the Impressionist movement, and that really distinguishes it from what's going on in most of the art world. I think, now we think of the Impressionist movement as what was happening in late 19th century Paris, but it's not what was happening in late 19th century Paris. The salon and the world of academic art and official commissions, this was the main sort of ball game. And of course, in that world, painting quickly had no real value. I mean, it was really about precision, licked enamel-like surfaces of, that we find in the work of painters like Gérôme, Chapelain, Bonnat, all of whom Cassatt actually studies with at one point or another. In a way that distinguishes her from many sort of female artists of her generation. She has a really quite serious academic formation, first at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and then with these various sort of academic masters and studying after old master paintings all over Europe. So, I do think that, as she goes on, there's something increasingly like a little bit sort of show-offy about the swift passages of paint that surround the very much more meticulous and slow-burning naturalism that we usually find in the faces, especially sort of accelerating in the 1880s, 1890s, that kind of pattern of attention. But yeah, I do think that the contrast to Berthe Morisot is an interesting one, because I think Morisot has a totally different training, and a training that is maybe in certain respects a little bit more typical of a woman artist in the period, that she really is formed as a landscape painter, as somebody working en plein air, outdoors, which is a kind of painting that does valorize speed more, because of course you're trying to capture changing effects of light and weather. Cassatt is really a figure painter to her bones. The landscapes are not usually, in my opinion, as successful as the figure paintings. And Morisot is somebody who also, I think, eventually develops a method of painting very, very quickly, right after the birth of her daughter. because she literally has less time in which to produce work. You know, so that's a very different set of circumstances from Cassatt.
Great. Oh, wait. So maybe this question and one more, and then we'll be done. So the politics behind the painting.
I'm going to tackle it just from the angle of Cassatt and the suffrage movement, because she does become, quite a proponent and an advocate for the American suffrage movement. She actually doesn't get involved in any of the suffrage efforts in France. So she, it really starts largely with her about 1907, she starts encouraging her friend Louisine Havemeyer, who's recently widowed. She says, work for the suffrage. If the world's to be saved, it's women who will save it. And she's writing to everyone in her address book, trying to encourage them to support the suffrage movement. And we have a colleague called Nicole Georgopoulos, who has recently written a brilliant article about a painting in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, a painting that has a restriction in its gift to the museum that it cannot be lent. So you have to go to Washington to see it, but it is showing what appears to be a mother and a child, and the mother has a very large sunflower brooch pinned to her, appears to be a sort of comfortable sort of morning gown or a dressing gown. And Nicole Georgopoulos has demonstrated that the sunflower was the symbol of the American suffrage movement. And it was constantly used on badges, and yellow would be your yellow sash. And that would tell other people who recognized that you were a proponent, you were supporting the suffrage movement. And that it's for many, many years, no one recognized that sunflower in Cassatt's painting was sort of deliberately sort of was a sign of of Cassatt's support for suffrage. They weren't reading it into her work. And I think that often is true of Cassatt, in that we had a tendency to take things too much at face value, and not to kind of understand some of the more subtle sort of signs and suggestions that are in her work. She does become much more politically active from about 1900 onwards. So I think it's perhaps a little harder to see her as being so politically motivated in every work that she's doing earlier, although she's always advocating for independent women who are well-read, who are out and about in the world. You want to add?
I don't know that I have anything to add. I mean, I wonder a little bit if the decoration, the monumental decoration that she creates for the Women's Pavilion of the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, this amazing sort of mural about modern woman and the kind of generational transfer of knowledge between women has a place in this conversation as well. And it does feel a little bit telling that here is this gigantic mural painting that she created that has vanished. I think so. The question is about the Société des Peintres Graveurs and the change of the name to make it a French-only organization. I think that that change really signals is a shift that happens in the 1890s and sort of accelerates over the course of the decade in a, slightly ugly way in France, as in many places in the world, a sort of rise of nationalism, that culminates really in the end with the First World War. So, yeah.
Great. Yes, let's kind of summarize that.
Say a little more about the complicated relationships being portrayed between mother and children, where sometimes it looks more like a struggle than a
Yes,
caress.
exactly. And and the question also is thinking about her trajectory through her career. I might have to get back to you a little bit on that. There is, I think there is a moment in the 1890s, right around the time of the child's caress here in the Honolulu Museum collection, which is right around the time of the Philadelphia painting, which is also called Maternal Caress. And you also see this in the prints, in which you do see, children kind of basically this power struggle, and give fingers all over the woman's face. And Cassatt is very attentive to children's behavior. And I think if you look at many of her works, you'll see the child, you see their face. And the woman's face will be much more obscured. Sometimes you only see them from the side of the head. And there've been lots of discussion about, Cassatt's interest and how she's very attuned to children and seems to really sort of understand some of their interior life and the psychology of childhood. And to some extent, I think we haven't paid quite enough attention to the caregiver, and that we've been so focused on the child that I think it's a good reminder to stop and look at the other side of that relationship, and they very much are about relationships that are, that it's not all, a sort of perfect, sweet day with, a child and a well-rested adult. I mean, there's a kind of, it feels very real, I think, and that she's not trying to gloss over some of the difficulties, or trying to keep a child from poking their fingers in your mouth or your nose or other things. But it's striking to me that Cassatt, who doesn't have children and doesn't very often actually even live with them, can pick up just from the moment she is with children on such sort of telling gestures. And then also to kind of, she's obviously observed, the adult kind of powerfully, but with a kind of sense of sensitivity, sort of holding that arm at bay. But I'd have to think more about, she does get much more sentimental as she moves into the 20th century, and in the way that she's capturing some of those relationships.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, both of you, for giving us a lovely day.